Let's start today's show with a challenge. Could you make the connection between the sovereignty of states in outer space and a plate of spaghetti, and space law and the muscle of a mad dog? To quote the father of outer space law, Mr. Gabriel Laferrandari, we come to understand that if we try to extend vertically across national borders, we arrive at a situation resembling that spaghetti you are trying to squeeze from your plate. Everything mixes up, end of quote. Public international law is a mainly reactive branch of law, although it's true that it does not generate taxation. If it constitutes a break, we could mark the commonly accepted limits of what is not allowed. It represents that muscle that we put on the dog before the threat of the attack. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to SpaceConneX Space Show. Today's space show titled Humanity's Sustainable Presence on the Moon. We'll delve into the sustainable presence on the moon and discuss how partnerships could help shaping a sustainable lunar economy. With an upbeat panel discussions with our esteemed guests today, we welcome Dr. Franziska Knur, Ms. Donna Lawler from Australia, and Mr. Professor Stephen Freeland from Australia, and Mr. Professor Kai-Uwe Schrogl, who is the president of the International Institute for Space Law, and we have the honor for him to moderate this episode. In this interactive panel discussion, which we invite you to join, we'll discuss the state of the international relations related to humanity's lunar endeavors, as well as possible economic models to establish a standalone lunar economy, and how can international partnerships ensure the lunar economic development without jeopardizing the outer space environment. And without further ado, I will hand over to our moderator today.
Thank you. Let's see. So thank you very much for the introduction. We are here for a real exciting topic and an exciting panel. We have Franziska, Donna, and Stephen, our experts, who will introduce the topic from various angles. And in the discussion, I'm pretty sure we will come up with new ideas, solutions for problems, and also for perspective. As you will be able to see, space law and space regulation is not so boring a topic, but it's also inspiring. And not only that it's necessary, it can also pave the way for the ideas we have and also for the visions we have. And I'm sure we will be able during these 1 hour and a few minutes to show you that a good and proper way of regulating space activities and confirming the rule of law in outer space is good for everybody. So we will be discussing the topic on presence on the moon. You might recall when you have seen the shows of the past half year that we have been assembling in almost the same configuration exactly half a year ago. It was in early January. And well, it's unimaginable how much activities, how many programs and projects have been rising during this past half year. We are present, robotically, of course, on Mars. We are present on Moon, and we have a new space station around the Earth. And we always have to be aware that going to the Moon with humans first requires a very good experience in Earth orbit. And so this experience is growing, and we are getting closer to a human presence on the moon. Now, let's go into the presentations. And the first presentation will be by Franziska Knur. Franziska is with the German Aerospace Center, the German Space Agency. She's a lawyer, and she's an expert in institutions and international organizations, where she wrote her doctorate thesis on. And what is very important for us, she is a delegate in the legal subcommittee of UN Corpus, is very active there, and has launched an initiative, which I hope she will also tell a little bit about, and which will certainly, very certainly, figure in our discussion. So, Franziska, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction, and also for the invitation, and say that I'm really, really honored to be with you today in this show with so distinguished guests, which have so much more experience than me. And so I'm also very eager to hear what Donna and Stephen have to tell us and how the discussion goes. But anyhow, I will try to dive into the topic with you, which is, I think, really well chosen: humanity's sustainable presence on the moon. And given my background, I, of course, will focus on some very general law and policy aspects, which I find cannot be reiterated enough. And everything I say, of course, is of my personal opinion and does not necessarily reflect the position of the agency I work for and that Kai-Uwe mentioned. So everyone who's listening in today is probably very much aware of the exciting missions that are currently planned and already prepared, having the moon as a first destination, but really actually just using the moon as a training ground for exploring and utilizing outer space and celestial bodies further away, such as Mars, other planets, and asteroids. And of course, everyone is also aware that it's not anymore a field of public space agencies alone. No, there are private investors and companies that are entering the scene, adding quite a lot of dynamic impulse and drive. And with this new era of space endeavors, also some additional motives and expectations are going with humanity to the moon and beyond. So, of course, it's still human curiosity that drives us. It is still scientific interests. Probably you will agree that it's also still about national pride and personal ambitions. But of a more novel and unique nature maybe are also the business and commercial interests that private actors bring into the game. And against all of this, I think one of the most important questions for us to deal with is how are we going to ascertain that we preserve and safeguard the values and the spirit that have been enshrined by the first pioneers and their governments when they entered the final frontier. And here, of course, I'm referring to the Outer Space Treaty, and especially Article 1, which reads that the exploration and use of outer space, including the moon and celestial bodies, shall be carried out for the benefit and in the interest of all countries, shall be the province of all humankind, and that outer space and celestial bodies shall be free for exploration and use by all states on the basis of equality and in accordance with international law. So for me, besides the formula province of all humankind and for the benefit and interest of all, and here I think this is also very important that we interpret all humankind as referring also to including future generations. So this brings with us a principle of sustainability, which we are talking about today as well. For me, as a lawyer, of course, it's especially important the phrase to focus on the phrase in accordance with international law. And this remains really a landmark provision. And I would like to show you today that this should not only be dear to us because some ancient folks have been enshrining this into the Outer Space Treaty, but now that it really serves us as a principle really well still today, and that we therefore must really trust in the inherent value of international law and multilateral processes when we try to find ways to address the challenges we face going to the moon and beyond. In order to convince you that international law is still a key to making the most of humanity's presence on the moon, let us take one step back and look again at what humans are going to bring when they go to the moon. On the one hand, of course, we bring quite some heavy investments. Everyone knows that spaceflight is costly, complex, and challenging. So there are heavy investments on the financial, personal, intellectual, scientific, public, and private level. On the other hand, everywhere we go, humans take with them a great deal of assumptions and expectations concerning, for instance, our own equipment and our own capabilities, but also concerning the environment we operate in and the consequences of our action. But maybe most importantly, we also bring with us assumptions and expectations concerning the behavior of others that are operating also in the same or in the nearby field of our operation. Now, when you look at the missions planned right now with the destination Moon, it is really overwhelming how interesting and challenging the mission objectives are. There are going to be landing sites installed, telecommunication and transport infrastructure be arranged, energy regenerated from spots of eternal light, large radio telescopes are to be installed for the exploration of deep space, human habitats will be built for scientific experiments, water and other resources that we find there will be prospected. Some other folks will research the origins of life in water ice near the poles. Others who are planning to prepare regolith manufacturing installations. I mean, we can really go on for quite a while with this enumeration. But what we also know so far is that the Moon might, although it might be quite large, many of the activities will be centered in close by areas such as the poles. And therefore, it's not only quickly going to be quite crowded, but activities are also likely to be conflicting and causing interferences to each other. So there will be dust stirred up at a landing site, for example, that will hamper the generation of energy from a solar panel within reach. Or signals from communication satellites in lunar orbit will impair the radio quiet necessary for those large radio telescopes trying to explore deep space. Water ice used for in situ generation of oxygen and hydrogen may cause or may be subject to contamination and thus cannot be used anymore for the research on the origins of life. Or a commercial facility may cut off access to other regions on celestial bodies which are really of scientific interest. And now here comes my question for you. Recall that we said that we bring to the Moon investments and expectations. How are we going to prevent conflict and harmful interference? How are we going to prevent that investments are ruined? How can we predict how others will behave themselves and not act to the detriment of our own activities? How do we solve the challenges we just outlined, such as coordination and information exchange, due regard? Well, of course, for me and probably also for my fellow panelists, the magic word really is law. In its basic notion, law serves to stabilize expectations concerning the behavior of people interacting. It assigns legitimate claims and rights and sanctions transgressions, thus really just securing investments of all kinds. And if there's anyone coming up with different solution, I would be really interested to hear it. I mean, if there's another way going on this endeavor and ensuring a sustainable presence on the Moon without this. But I feel that through all of humanity's past, we really haven't been finding better ways, maybe besides warfare, but this should really not be an option for us. And so the formulation of legal rules that are accepted by everyone is really our best choice. And as we are operating in an area that is by definition beyond national jurisdiction, it really can only be international law that gives us the necessary stability, trust, and predictability. And therefore national laws or even bilateral agreements between like-minded partners really will take us only so far as they are legitimately reaching. They will only be applicable to a handful of actors and do us no good in predicting or shaping how others will behave. Now, what is the challenge here when we want to ensure a sustainable presence on the Moon? I feel they are twofold. For one, we need to apply and implement the existing legal framework for space activities, which, let me say, really is not as outdated or flawed as some would like us to think. For sure, the challenge is to apply it also to non-governmental activities and also the new interests commercial actors bring to the table. But please be careful if someone is telling you that there are gaps in the existing legal framework. He or she might just not like the content of the rules that are applied. You are probably aware that we already have 5 treaties on outer space law, laying down the fundamental and still very useful and conflict-preventing principles. Although the most recent, the Moon Treaty, is not that widely accepted. And I feel that this is really to the detriment of everyone. So I urge you to have a look at the Moon Treaty. It contains a variety of very useful provisions which could help us with many of the problems I just mentioned. So it provides, for example, for information exchange regarding activities in stations. It regulates the use of land for station. It provides for emergency assistance, the protection of the celestial bodies from contamination. It also contains already quite explicit provisions on space resource utilization, a topic I know we are going to be focusing on today as well. So all in all, the Moon Treaty really could serve as a very excellent baseline for ensuring humanity's sustainable presence on the Moon. This brings me to the second challenge, and this would be developing additional elements of effective lunar governance. So here we have a variety of instruments at our disposal, which will slowly merge into a bigger and hopefully also coherent picture. And now here it may also be perceived as a challenge that many new and quite powerful private actors have entered the scene. And when we say that we need to develop further the legal rules that are accepted by everyone for the use of the celestial bodies operating in the field, well, should that then mean that we also need private actors at the table when we are formulating these new rules? I want to be honest and say, no, we don't. And maybe let me explain why. I believe it's still the government's purposes to represent private and public interests in international negotiations. So they should have in place the appropriate consultation mechanisms to take into account business interests when negotiating the legal framework for a sustainable lunar economy. At the same time, it's of course essential that it's not only actors with big money influencing the rulemaking process, but that they are also balanced with the views provided by civil society, the young generation, academia, other institutions, and additional stakeholders. And I feel that governments, at least in plural and liberal democracies, are quite well equipped to bring this variety of views to the international negotiating table without actually inviting them to join personally. So now I would like to conclude this introductory remarks with maybe a word of caution or expectation management. Of course, you will have heard before the call for international law, global governance of outer space activities, but then you see the very limited and slow progress made, for instance, in multilateral fora such as UNCOPUS. Of course, as Kai-Uwe mentioned, we had quite some hopeful signs during this year's legal subcommittee. But then you also witness the tensions between big spacefaring nations, and you also see how private actors do not seem to care so much about the rule of laws and the views of the international community. So let's be honest and say that there is, of course, one truth, being that a comprehensive international lunar governance regime is unlikely to be set up before humans return to the Moon and conduct activities there. I think this is a truth we must face. But at the same time, I feel that those who go first will not manifest the rules for generations to come. And I think the second point is something that sometimes demotivates people from entering into the difficult field of international negotiations. But I'm convinced that also we might look at the Wild West at first on the Moon. It's only a matter of time, as it was in many other areas of human exploration, that the call for justice, the rule of law, predictability, sustainability, and so on will follow closely. So what should we take from this? It's my sincere invitation to really trust in the inherent value of international law and multilateral processes. It has served humanity very well in so many other areas beyond national jurisdiction. It has preserved peace, sustainable and economic development and the well-being of people. Yes, it takes time to develop international law in a very inclusive multilateral process. But again, here's the invitation. Go ahead and name an alternative that is easier, better suited, more cost efficient, secure in investments, providing predictability, fairness, and so on. And so, of course, we should start right now with the development of an effective international lunar governance based on the rule of law. And I'm at the same time convinced that we are already on the right track, as we are witnessing in very many useful fora, very proficient discussions on basic rules and models of cooperation, including on the governmental level, such as the Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space. But at the same time, I feel that it will require really a joint effort by many. And for that, we need lots of smart and ambitious people to join the conversation, that are knowledgeable of the bigger picture and that have a vision and that will bring their national governments to deal with these questions, because I am convinced that this is the only way to really safeguard outer space and the celestial bodies, including the moon, for the exploration and use also for future generation. And this is why I'm happy to be here, a part of the conversation today. And I thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Franziska, for that excellent presentation and introduction to the topic. I was very much impressed about your really strong statement that those who go first will not manifest the rules for generations to come. Well, is this just a wish from yours, or are you really so optimistic, and why will that happen in your view?
No, I'm optimistic that this holds true, this basic assumptions, because I think everywhere where humanity goes, it's about trial and error. And of course, there are those pioneers, and it's good that they also maybe have some freedom of exploration to go and conduct their activities, prospect. But at the same time, as we learn more about the consequences of these activities and also more investments are really made, I think the call for rule of law, justice, equality, equal access will only really be stronger. Maybe one caveat I want to introduce is we really need to make sure that then it's not too late to safeguard the interests of also future generation. So concerns of sustainability really must be our first priority, even for those early activities when we now return to the moon.
Let me ask you another question. It's related to that. You talked about trust in international law and multilateral processes also. How can this trust be generated? Do we have enough trust already, or do we need to do something? What should governments do? What should industry do? What should civil society do?
Well, I feel that there is lots of trust already in international law. You know that we have for decades basic rules enshrined in the UN Charter, for example, which really have, at most times, of course it's not a perfect system, but in most times preserved peace and stability and friendly relations between states. And I feel once states come up with an agreement on what legal rules and norms should be, then this basic fact really serves its purpose and provides predictability. Of course, the process at arriving there is very difficult. And right now we seem to lack quite some trust, which is also prerequisite for effective and successful negotiations. So here, but this is something that we see in many different fora, we will probably have to start up with non-binding principles first and see how actors behave on the basis on that, whether they comply with them, and only slowly then move into more binding rules of law.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Franziska. Now let's turn to Donna. Donna is principal at Azimuth Advisory, Space Law Specialists, and she has been advising governments for many years. So she has a very broad experience, not only with governmental, but also with commercial entities, and this will be the topic of your talk now. We have already discussed the perspectives of a lunar economy half a year ago. There have been quite a few developments in this respect as well. NASA in particular is looking more and more into public-private partnership schemes. And maybe you will touch on that and provide us with an update, and also possibly respond to what Franziska said about the trust in international law and regulation, and what you think, whether the companies and the entities involved in the prospective lunar economy share that trust in international regulation. Donna, up to you.
Well,
Donna, up to you.
Well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and thank you for having me. The Space Show and Space for Women. It's a wonderful series of podcasts. And thank you, Francisca, for a lovely, really interesting presentation. And I will indeed, Kai-Uwe, respond to some of the things she said, because who do we trust to look after space is a really key. It's a key question. In case anyone's wondering why I have the mute on my screen, but you can still hear me, and that's because I am actually sitting next to the man of my dreams and co-principal at Azimuth Advisory, Stephen Freeland. He's actually right there. We're using the same microphone, so it looks like he's speaking, but in fact it's me at the moment. Okay, well, just to start this topic, when I started thinking about what is this, sustainable lunar economy going to look like, it reminds me of when I was speaking at an off-Earth mining conference back in 2013, which is a long time ago, when nobody was really thinking about it back then, other than maybe Elon Musk. But I gave a little half-hour talk on the Moon Agreement and what that might mean in the international framework. And then when I stepped outside the room, there was a press pack, like a whole about 20 reporters standing there, and they interviewed me about, do you think, space mining is going to happen soon? And I gave like a 20-minute answer, but ended with, moon mining might be closer than we think. Well, that ended up being the headline that went around the world. It was translated, someone wrote an article, it was translated into 72 languages, and it made it look like I was the greatest advocate for lunar resources. I did hold the view that it was sooner than we think, and I think that's actually true, even if it is still a bit of some time away. But I should have realized what I have been told in the past by a friend of mine who is a TV show maker and a filmmaker, that the most interesting topics to people that always get their attention are space, sharks, and the search for Nazi gold. For some reason, they're the three topics that are always ratings gold. But so people are fascinated by space, and they're fascinated by Elon Musk and the amazing achievements that he's made. And some people trust him and some people are very, very wary of him. He has been advocating for what he says colonization of Mars since 2010. And at first that led people like me to not take him seriously at all. I was doing some serious negotiations with him back around that time. And commercial negotiations, but I thought, who can talk about going to Mars and be taken seriously? But I was wrong. We all have to take Elon Musk seriously now. Of course, back then he said the first colonists would arrive no earlier than the middle of the 2020s. Well, who knows? Maybe he's on track, but I think he's running out of time to meet that deadline. Still. In April of this year, NASA and the US Space Force contracted with SpaceX to develop, manufacture, and operate 2 lunar missions with the Starship lunar lander. So There's an example of a public-private partnership that the US anyway is hoping will lead to a sustainable human presence on the moon. This whole, and I'm going to focus a little bit on NASA because during this talk, because I think that that this public-private partnership, it's followed, a model followed around the world for lots of things. In Australia, we're always building roads and bridges with public-private partnerships, but NASA really started to go for it in a big way back in when it was needing to solve the problem of how is it going to get up to the International Space Station. So I'm diverting, but I'm going to come back, so don't worry. Elon Musk at that time was a huge beneficiary of NASA's what they called the Commercial Orbital Transportation Services Program, which was an innovative and economical approach for NASA to partner with industry to develop commercial cargo services. And as a result, SpaceX was actually able to help them sustainably create a service to get cargo and humans back and forth to the International Space Station. And so they were so thrilled with how that program went over at NASA and the way that they reduced the development costs by 80% or something for the delivery services and the operating costs, that they decided to extend that model to what they call cislunar space, so the space between the moon and Earth. So this is one type of partnership. It's the public partnership, public and private partnership. Of course, some of the other amazing panelists here are going to be talking a bit more about the international partnerships, but just looking at this public-private partnership, and it also becomes international as we go. Quite an influential paper was published in 2017 advocating that NASA follow this, what they call the COTS model, the Commercial Cargo Services model, or Commercial Cargo Transport Services to the moon. So they started to call it Lunar COTS, or Commercial Operations and Transport Services. So this paper in 2017 was advocating partnership agreements between NASA and industry teams to create sustainable lunar infrastructure. And the idea was that NASA and its industry partners would share costs in the development phase and then later transfer the operation of this lunar infrastructure back to its industry owners when they got to the execution phase. And so this is a model that NASA has really started to embrace in a big way, and it's created a lot of opportunities primarily for US companies, but also for a lot of European companies, and I think Australia is hoping also Australian companies. So there may be other countries around the world as well. But I went back and I looked at the paper that was really pushing this in detail, a very detailed study, and it was interesting to see some of the ideas that were underpinning that whole concept. So, and I'm just going to take you to some of those things. So in that paper, they compared the successful colonization of the Americas and Christopher Columbus as being an example of an early public-private partnership. And then they compared that with what they saw was an unsuccessful effort to create an economy around resources in Antarctica. So that's what this paper was doing. It was saying, look, we've done a great job colonizing over here, but we did a terrible job because look at all the colonies that are not in Antarctica, and the mining industry, we never got off the ground. In fact, we banned it. And so I'll even read some of the bits. Lessons learned from the Antarctica failure included that there were no policy requirements to stimulate commercial activity at the South Pole. Their sole mission was focused on science. The mining was officially prohibited by the 1991 Madrid Protocol. There was no strong incentive to allow the infrastructure services to be completed within industry, and the entire culture and value system of the international Antarctica community was aligned to discourage and prevent private investment. So in this paper, they were shaking their heads saying, what a terrible outcome that was. Let's do it differently on the moon. Of course, many would see the prevention of mining in the pristine wilderness of Antarctica as a success story rather than an economic failure. Most people don't look at that and think, oh, what a failure. It's still pristine. That's a disaster. And yet that is the model that some are looking to move away from in order to create this lunar economy. So I just want to comment that in a lot of the rhetoric that is coming out of this cis-lunar economy discussion, a lot of the people promoting that are using very loaded words like colonization and talking about, creating trillionaires and so on out of this economy. But I actually believe that a lot of the advocates of that cis-lunar economy are doing their own cause harm by being insensitive around that language and also ignoring the concerns and even the feelings of the international community. Because I don't think they realize that in order to operate, they need a social license for their activities, not just within the United States, but also from the international community. And in the future, they may also need, and I think that's highly likely, some form of actual legal license from the international community. So there is a perception that they can go there by some, that the moon is the wild, wild west and they can go there and do what they want, but conveniently ignoring the international community. My personal view, so I'm in a funny straddling position here because a lot of my clients are looking to be part of this economy, or our clients at Azimuth Advisory. We act for companies that are wanting to succeed in this economy. So I'll be quite honest about this. My personal view is I'm a little bit, I'm in two minds about whether or not we should create this economy at all. There is a part of me that is very excited about it, and I want all of my clients to succeed in it commercially as well. But for them to succeed, I think we need to have a multilateral international system, and we need something that is going to create that social license internationally and create proper rules and regulations around sustainability. So the topic of today's discussion is about sustainability. We haven't, of course, it's interesting that we haven't really defined what we mean by sustainable. What is a sustainable lunar economy? Is it a sustainable economic, from an economic point of view, or is it sustainable from an environmental point of view, or both, or even from a social point of view, social sustainability? So that's where I personally stand. I actually wanted to succeed, but I wanted to succeed in a very responsible and multilateral way that brings benefits to the earth and not the harms and horrors that many have experienced during colonization in past ages. So just moving on then to some of the goals of the lunar public-private concept that NASA is talking about. They're wanting to develop affordable and commercial, what they call cislunar surface capabilities. So they're talking about, what are they talking about in practice here? That lunar cargo delivery, power generation, communications, and even then creation of space markets for economic growth, all summed up in one phrase that has been used frequently: a robust lunar industrialization environment. So that's some of the rhetoric around this, and that could be very exciting to some people, and to other people it sounds terrifying and horrific. So I think the different strong feelings around all of this need to be taken into account. So because I'm a commercial lawyer, I'm going to quickly talk about some of the commercial principles that they're using, because it's me, because I'm interested in it, because I'm interested in the commercial contractual side. And it's interesting to see what their pathway to commercial success is. So their aim is, NASA and government entities in the US are looking to partner with partners like Northrop Grumman and SpaceX, and even international partners and even international businesses. They want to do it like this. They want to make long-term commitments to their international and commercial partners, and with the aim of securing private investment. And the idea is that NASA would be an anchor customer for these companies, but not the sole customer. So these commercial partners who might be building lunar transport systems or off-Earth mining systems, they intend them to target space markets outside of government in order to close their business cases. So, for example, they're looking to put a price on lunar water. They're offering to enter into contracts with private companies that are able to extract it. Another principle that they use commercially is they want their commercial partners to retain intellectual property, which is a really different approach to most government contracts with private entities. Normally, government is like a giant intellectual property vacuum cleaner. They want to own everything if possible. And but NASA took a different view here, and they said, no, we're going to try and promote investment by allowing our partners to own the intellectual property and then to actually make money from that. So they use a different type of agreement rather than the standard US government contracting. They're called funded Space Act agreements, or at least I don't know if they're always done that way, but quite often. So all of this led to what we now know as the Artemis Program. Began formally in December 2017, started by the Trump administration, endorsed by the Biden administration, with the short-term goal of landing the first woman on the moon. Their mid-term goal is to establish an international expedition team and a sustainable human presence on the moon. So there we've got our sustainable presence on the moon idea. And their long-term goal is to lay the foundations for private companies to build a lunar economy, and eventually resulting in sending humans to Mars and beyond. So that's the economic plan and model that they're using. So they're predominantly doing this, NASA itself and US commercial spaceflight contractors, so like SpaceX and Northrop Grumman and so on. But they've also, through the Artemis Accords, engaging other countries. And so far they've got countries in Europe, and they've got Luxembourg, Australia, Japan, Canada, Italy, UAE, Ukraine, Brazil, South Korea, and New Zealand. So that NASA has spent so far $37.2 billion on Artemis, which is a lot of money. And the predictions are that by 2025, they will have spent $86 billion. So that's amazing, considering that it's meant to be a public-private partnership. That's still a lot of money going into these sorts of things. So the aim is to get this moon to Mars economy happening as well. So, for example, going to the moon, extracting water resources, using the water as fuel to get to Mars, and taking some of that water to Mars to use for habitats on Mars as well, and humans on Mars. So this has caused a great deal of excitement in the world. You've got US companies angling to get in, European Space Agency and agencies, as well as private entities in Europe. And then even down here in Australia, there is, the Australian government has committed 150 million Australian dollars in grants for what they call the Australian Moon to Mars Supply Chain Program. So they're already starting to dole out money to Australian companies to help them get into this NASA supply chain. And a number of our clients have been beneficiaries of some of that grant money. So we've got clients that are, for example, making small computers that can operate to process data in space, and they got one of these grants. And we've got another client that is building an orbital transport that will be able to take payloads within that lunar economy, so to low Earth orbit, geostationary orbit, and then around the moon as well. So this is just from the Australian point of view, and I imagine a lot of other countries are doing the same thing, trying to develop their own economies by hitching their wagon to NASA and getting to the moon. So I'll quickly talk about sustainability then, and then I'll touch on what the benefits might be to Earth. I think I've got about 5 minutes left. Is that okay, moderators? Okay. All right. So what do we mean by sustainable? Clearly, NASA's rhetoric is all about economic sustainability, but they also put a lot of things on their website and things they say about environmental sustainability as well. Until pretty recently, there hasn't really been any consideration of the space environment as something worth protecting. It's a kind of a new concept. Nobody's really thought about what are the environmental effects of mass space tourism or mass spacecraft going up. It's starting to become, in the last few years, more of an issue as people started to be concerned about potential overload of space debris, as well as overload of private and government spacecraft in orbit. So, you know, as we know, there is a plan for about 48,000 Starlink spacecraft to be launched over the next few years. So who is my question, who is going to decide whether we have too many spacecraft and whether that's going to make the space environment unsustainable for space travel and space services? Who's going to call time out when we reach that critical mass? Hopefully we'll get enough cooperation before we create some form of tragedy of the commons. A little quote from the science fiction legend Arthur C. Clarke, who wrote in 1995, we can't really mess up the moon either by mining it or building nuclear power plants. We can ruthlessly strip mine the surface of the moon for centuries and it will be hard to tell we've even been there. The same is true of atomic power. We could wage unlimited nuclear warfare on the surface of the moon and be hard pressed after the dust had settled to tell anything had happened. And he was even making fun of future environmentalists. He said, no doubt lunar prospectors will eventually be confronted by the Society for the Preservation of Pristine Regolith, he said sarcastically, to trying to protect the unsullied natural landscape of the moon. Well, since then, in fact, there have been, so as his predictions often were, his predictions were right. There is now growing concern about the environment of the moon. There is a concern about damage to the surface. There is concern about damage to space heritage there. There is, for example, concern about putting too much exhaust gas into the environment, which is unable to escape. So are we going to be getting benefits on Earth as a result of creating this cislunar economy? I know that there are many who say, oh, space is becoming democratized, but I think we have to keep in mind that private corporations are often even less accountable than governments, who are themselves often not very accountable. So is it a mistake to say that that we're democratizing space, perhaps we're just privatizing space, and perhaps that's not the same thing? Going back to your comment, Francisca, about what is the trust? Is creating space trillionaires going to help us on Earth, or is it just going to make life more unequal? I know we're going to discuss that a bit more on this panel. Are there technologies that are going to help us on Earth? Because of the original lunar mission, we got post-it notes. That was pretty good. What are we going to get out of the cislunar economy? Are we going to get world peace, for example? There are some that advocate if with commercialization of this area, it will become difficult for anyone to have a war in space because there is such an active commercial environment there. It will discourage all of the players. But once again, perhaps we should consider history as a cautionary tale, given that some of the original thoughts about this public-private partnership came about with a comparison with Christopher Columbus, European powers sending sailing ships to the new world, looking for resources in the 15th century. What happened? They promptly went to war with one another to defend all those shipping lanes and territories. So we need to look at our own history as a planet and say, let's make sure we don't make the same mistakes, and let's not use the same rhetorical devices to push ourselves down that path without standing back and figuring out what we need to do differently this time around. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Donna. That was exciting. You were also ending with the issue of trust and optimism or pessimism, and you pointed back to history. Well, I had to hold my breath at some points when you talked about colonization and all these things, and it's really scary. I think these people who use the term colonization for Moon and Mars and space in general, it's not simply rhetoric, they just mean it. They have the same concepts, the same awful, horrific concepts of conquering, of killing, slaughtering. Well, there are no green people on Mars or so, but everything which was a tragedy in colonization, be it with the humans, with the animals, with the environment, they simply don't care. They want to make profit. And your point on Antarctica is really revealing. If any person could say we failed with Antarctica, it's amazing to hear that. Now a question to you. Antarctica is a moratorium on specific activities. Is it too late to establish moratoria in outer space? Would that be useful? Is it realistic? What do you think?
It's a really interesting comment, isn't it? Because it's how do we protect something that belongs to us all as opposed to belongs to no one? I think a moratorium might be a good thing to consider. Certainly, I'm sure it's part of the range of solutions that is going to be considered by the international community. My personal view is, given the level of investment by the powers that be in getting there, I can't see a moratorium being agreed by, as a practical measure, by the international community. But I do think probably the best realistic outcome that we can get to is a framework that allows for sustainability and benefits on Earth and benefits to everyone on Earth, not just to a few trillionaires. But that's why we're lucky to have Stephen here to talk about that, because that's precisely what he spends his days considering and discussing. So
okay. Perfect. So without further ado, to Stephen. I don't have to introduce Stephen. Maybe I just point out that he now has a space law show on Spacewatch Global, where he meets people, I think, every month or every 6
2
weeks.
months. Every two
Okay.
months.
To talk about recent developments in space law, and we are glad that you are joining us here, and maybe you are contradicting Donna, or are you just adding on what Donna said? Okay, Stephen, to you.
Thank you, Kai-Uwe. I would never dare contradict my partner in life. Thank you, Heen and Malak and everybody associated with this show for inviting us back. It's great. It's a wonderful program. And Francisca and Donna and Kai-Uwe, thank you for all of your incredibly insightful comments. I'll share my screen as I talk because what I'm going to focus on is, in a sense, the most boring part of the program, that is talking about law. Hopefully you can see my screen now. But I'm doing that with a broader perspective because law, as Francisca and Donna and Kai-Uwe have stressed, is an incredibly important part of the way that humanity and its interaction, relationship, respect for, and exploration and use will be determined. Without law, without understandings, without cooperation at a broad level, notwithstanding the fact that there are countries that can do various things on their own. Without a broader perspective, my thesis is that we stand real risks of developing a situation which is an unthinkable situation for space, both in terms of sustainability, but also in terms of the potential for conflict. So if I may, remind everybody the obvious, but I think the obvious is important in this discussion. There are so many voices that are relevant when we talk about space. Today, we're talking about law, we're talking about politics, we're talking about the commercial aspects. But there are many, many other voices. All of those are important voices, as are those voices about national security. But there are and will remain and have always been other voices about the scientific nature of space, the cultural aspects of space, the religiosity of space, the heritage aspects of space, space and its connection with lives, livelihood, and human rights. Space is so many things to so many people. And indeed, I believe, and I think most people would agree with me, that the future of humanity is inextricably tied to the way that we interact with space. As Francisca says, not only for our generation or for our children's generation, but for future generations. So I think even though I'm going to focus on law and various initiatives at the multilateral and other levels around governance ideas, please don't think that I'm advocating that law is the magic bullet that will solve everything. It's an incredibly important part, but there are so many voices to be heard. An obvious reminder as well, but I think it's relevant also for what we're talking about today, is who is engaged in space. In the relatively early times of humans' activities in space, and then sort of driven by the launch of Sputnik in 1957, space was initially really the area that was utilized in whatever way, shape, or form by countries, and indeed only a relatively small number of countries who had primarily strategic, military, and geopolitical eyes. They developed technologies that you and I and everybody listening to this program use every day without even thinking about it. 10, 20, 30 times a day we use that technology. But all of those technologies were developed with military, strategic, geopolitical, national security eyes. But subsequently, if we fast forward to where we are today, there are a whole range of participants engaged in space. That's a function of the development of technology. That's a function of the development of a broader range of capabilities. That's a function of the development of a commercial sector, which is driven by consumers. You and I want more and more and more. We want satellite broadcast through television, which was really a driving factor as early as the 1960s. Even before the treaties, we had the first international satellite broadcast from satellite, coincidentally, the opening of the Tokyo Olympic Games in 1964. And here we are all this time later, and hopefully we'll have an Olympic Games starting shortly also in Tokyo. But as consumers, humans wanted more from space. But as a humanity, we needed more from space because it also provided incredible benefits. The whole of humanity has prospered in relative terms because of the benefits that the peaceful uses of space have given. That said, and we've already heard from Donna and Franziska and Kai-Uwe about the commercial sector, there's also developed this massive commercial sector. You see the numbers there, 380, 400 billion US dollars guesstimated to be the global space economy in 2020, but projected to grow exponentially, depending on which investment bank you believe, to somewhere between $1 and $3 trillion by 2040, not including the potential for this so-called cislunar economy that Franziska and Donna talked about. So space is also big business, which is driving a lot of the discussions. A lot of the national initiatives that I'll refer to were driven by lobbying from industry to government. And a lot of reactions to law, and in particular the Moon Agreement, were driven by the reactions of industry to government. So the commercial sector is important. The commercial sector sees dollar signs in their eyes about this new economy. But to create an economy, clearly you need the capability, you need, in a sense, lost leadership, because things will go wrong. As Franziska said in answer to one of your questions, Kai-Uwe, we learn by our mistakes, but it's going to be incredibly complex, incredibly expensive. At the moment, the costs far outweigh any potential revenues, realistically, and so you will need governments to be involved, government subsidies along the way. So I want to focus on space resource activities, where humanity seems to have made the decision that Donna and Franziska were discussing. Because of a role that I play at the UN, I won't give my own opinion on this. However, humanity seems to have said, this is something we want to do. And of course, then if that is the direction that humanity wants to go, as Franziska and Donna have said, we can only really be happy with that if the way that moves forward is in accordance with rules of the road, understandings, cooperation, multilateral and global frameworks that allow for sustainability, that minimize potential for conflict. So, as I said, the United Nations is looking at a discussion about what they call the exploration, exploitation, and utilization of space resources. 3 different terms. That is what the agenda item on legal subcommittee is. So the question is, assuming that's something that humanity wants to do, how do we move forward? How do we move along that spectra from understanding what this is about to exploration, etc.? Well, we need commercial business models. We need expertise, and as I say, we need the creation of a market. Well, in terms of the commercial initiatives, there are many companies that now profess that they have capabilities, they have the wherewithal, they'll have the financial backing to engage in various types of resource extraction activities. I mentioned there, though, too, planetary resources and deep space industries. They were, in a sense, and pardon the pun in terms of colonization, they were the pioneers in this area. And you'll see I have rest in peace next to both of them, because they have come and gone essentially in this business. Now, they are being replaced by others, but there's a real lesson to be learned there, that the hype the development of some ideas is a long way short from developing viable ways of moving forward, given the technical, geopolitical, cultural, economic, and all sorts of other complexities. People talk about in situ resource utilization. Why do they do that? Because the initial companies said, well, we're going to go to space, let's say the moon, we're going to mine, we're going to get things like helium-3, we're going to bring them back to Earth, we're going to save Earth. But no commercial model ever allowed for that to make any form of sense. And so the business cases you see now are almost exclusively one way. We're going to go, we're going to do whatever we do in terms of resource exploration, exploitation, and we're going to create that economy there in situ, rather than, if you like, translating that back to Earth. Now that may change down the track, but that's the current thinking, and it gives rise to a whole range of questions about, well, what benefits will there be on Earth? So
Stephen, 5 minutes, please. 5 minutes.
Yes, sure. So what's at stake? We have various resources. On the moon, we talk about water. The question is, some say we must do this because this will save humanity. This will allow us to redistribute wealth. This will save the Earth environment. Others say, alternatively, this is a land grab. This is conflict. And so there are many, many different issues in place. I won't bore you all with the law, except to say that the Outer Space Treaty and the Moon Agreement raise questions. Francisca talked about freedoms. So is commercial utilization of resources in line with activities for the benefit and the interests of all countries? We have non-appropriation. Is non-appropriation about just resources? Non-appropriation, in my mind, is almost the most important principle in the Outer Space Treaty amongst many important principles, because it is one of those rare proactive principles that was put in to avoid conflict. We have other provisions about responsibility and liability. Of course, they inure to countries. And how will those provisions be used to make companies and corporates comply with the rules? How do we monitor resource activities? All of these questions can be raised by the Outer Space Treaty. I don't have the answers, I have the questions only. We have the Moon Agreement. Francisca's given a really good summary of what that's about. It only has a relatively small number of states parties. Is it practical in terms of relevance? It certainly has ideas that I think will filter up. There are other issues about debris and the environment, and we have some guidelines, but how do they work in terms of activities on the moon? What about heritage? What about avoiding interference? There are a whole range of other issues. Francisca mentioned there are initiatives, there's national law. A number of countries, most recently Japan, have passed their national laws that seem to encourage their nationals to engage in these activities. Donna mentioned the Artemis Accords. China and Russia are cooperating and inviting others to engage. So there are various initiatives, but from my perspective, really in the end, all of this feeds into an intergovernmental approach. I've mentioned that COPOS has looked at this item, and we've had now a fora where ultimately just now a working group has been established by the legal subcommittee to start this exploratory process to work out what global rules of the road can we move to. So the way forward is there will be many discussions, many initiatives brought forward, many inputs from national law, from civil society, moving upwards into multilateral discussions. Why do we need the multilateral process? Well, there are risks. Will states agree to a multilateral process? overseeing, overarching whatever activities we have on the moon, and then ultimately in other celestial bodies. What is the effect of countries having national initiatives where they encourage this activity, notwithstanding some of the uncertainties that might arise at the international level? And if we don't get a multilateral process, a potential, and I only say potential, worst case scenario is that notion of non-appropriation, that notion of putting something there to avoid conflicts, because as Donna said, anything about appropriating or colonizing or resources on Earth has often led to conflicts and war. And non-appropriation is an incredibly important part of maintaining the peace and security and safety of space. If we don't reach an agreement, then that is the issue. My last slide, Kai-Uwe. So I'm also an optimist. It looks as if this is a panel of optimists, but also realists. If you go back to 1979, when the international community did agree the Moon Agreement, by consensus, the terms were agreed, although, as Francisca said, not many states have moved forward to ratify, but the terms were agreed. What was then perhaps possible is now perhaps probable, although perhaps on that regard, I still think we're a long way away from anything that might approach something on a commercial basis, notwithstanding all of we have to overcome all the other issues. This is a big issue. This is a fundamental issue about our interaction with space today and as we move forward. And we must, as we talk about this, given that humanity seems to have decided this is a path we want to go, we must always keep that humanity in mind. So from my perspective, the underlying, amongst many, but the underlying principle in all of this is to avoid the potential for conflict. Notwithstanding that various countries or groups of countries believe that they can move forward in whatever way, shape, and form, to the extent that others who might have similar capabilities but are not part of those arrangements, to the extent that those other countries also engage in those activities, we really do have scope for misunderstandings. We really have scope for differences. And my perspective is, in fact, every country has everything much more in common than they do differences. Everybody needs to ensure that space retains an element of sustainability. So my crystal ball gazing is that ultimately there'll be hard bargaining, there'll be differences of opinion that must be overcome, but ultimately we will move to a widely agreed framework, whatever that might be, whatever that might look like, which will encourage cooperation between states. And obviously states will bring in their non-governmental entities and corporates under their jurisdiction who have expertise. But ultimately, the overarching rules call for and require a multilateral process. We don't know what that would look like, but we know that there's a common good faith feeling that in the end, notwithstanding our differences, that is the solution that will serve humanity's interests the most. I'm sorry, Kai-Uwe, if I've gone slightly over time. I hope you'll forgive me. Thank you, everybody. And I'll look forward to the discussion that follows. Thank you, Kai-Uwe.
Thank you, Stephen. I do forgive you. Thank you for that. Thank you for that inspiring talk. Stephen, lawyer and optimist, as I learned now. But let me challenge you. Because you were 2 minutes too long, I will now challenge you with a very, very difficult question. You were talking about the fundamental issues, right? And we are all thinking, fearing also that the character of space as a global common is threatened and slowly, is fading away. Now, what would you say, could we learn from space as a global common, as it has been so far, for our earthly politics, where nothing is a common anymore, and where neoliberalism and conflict abounds. What can we, or should we learn from space as a global common and as it had been organized so far?
Oh, Kai-Uwe, thank you. If we all had the answers, I think everybody on this panel would win the Nobel Peace Prize if we had the real answer to that. But I think there's a lot to be learnt about the way, notwithstanding differences, we've engaged in space. We've had 63 or 64 years of activities since Sputnik, a lot of it during the Cold War period, and now we're in, if you like, some tense periods terrestrially, and have been for a period of time. And yet, by and large, space has worked. And also we have avoided conflict. And why? Why is that the case? Well, of course, the legal principles have helped, but of course it takes road, law is sometimes broken. Where we really will learn from space is I think, three things. Firstly is that common interest. It's in the common interest of us all to maintain this area. As it is, and Donna and you refer to Antarctic, it's in the common interest, in a sense, to maintain Antarctica as a relatively pristine area. So we have more in common with space because we are all dependent on it and we all rely on it, and we would all suffer if we do the wrong thing. What's the second issue about space that we learn from? Space is about humanity, past, present, and future. Human rights, but also the future of humanity. All of humanity has benefited. All of humanity will continue to benefit, but we must incorporate into our thinking, as we have in space thus far, reincorporate that on Earth. And I know this sounds idealistic, but it's realistic. Elements of humanity. That's what the Geneva Conventions talk about when it comes to warfare, elements of humanity. And I think it's really important to sit back and really think about that, because when we talk about commercial aspects, you never in the same breath hear about humanity's aspects. And the third issue is one of, if you like, custodianship and stewardship. We are not doing a very good job, but we are custodians of where we reside on the planet Earth. And indeed, those that are promoting this cislunar economy say, well, this is part of our responsibility. We are also custodians for space. We have a stewardship relationship with space for all generations. And sadly, we're polluting space in a way that, as a business as usual, we are making the same mistakes on Earth. We need, before it's too late, to learn that once we destroy space irreversibly, we make it unnavigable, inaccessible, and unsustainable, then humanity suffers. Large countries suffer, large corporates suffer, as well as the whole of humanity. So I think it's a test case for us. We still have time. We still have time to create the right rules of the road to allow people to utilize space for in a peaceful way that maintains sustainability, but we are running out of time. But I still think if we learn those three principles from the history of how we've dealt with space, I think that can help us on Earth. Heaven forbid we're too late. Thanks, Kai-Uwe.
Amazing presentations and amazing insights, like as usual. And actually, I will return to one point without taking a lot of time to Donna, when you presented and you said sustainable economy could be taken or addressed from different perspectives. And it's amazing because I had one perspective in mind, and today with the way that each of you addressed it from his point of view and expertise, it's unbelievable. It's amazing. So to go back, the sustainable economy that I envisioned when I worked on the topic and the questions is this economy that provides for the greatest amount of general well-being with the least amount of resource used, taking into consideration the environment. So it's based on a doctrinal analysis I've done on taking sustainable development under international law, the rules, the principles, and everything. And I widened the scope of application to space. And at the same time, what I've done is I took a case study. It's with the orbital, how to create a sustainable orbital economy, taken on-orbit servicing, the OOS. And it's amazing how to create. I created like a ladder. It's going step by step from the sustainable orbital economy, going further to the lunar economy, and from there the transition to go to Mars. So this is the idea. A lot of implication in it from sustainable development perspective, and how to balance the interest, which is the economic development, the social development, and how to protect the environment and go further. So a lot of points are there, and how to create sustainable investments, which is Franziska also talked about. It's something very, very important in the dawn of the war between the two poles. You have the US and you have China and so many other nations that are surrounded as allies from the two poles. And like that, you have the problem of the national interest and the blockage to the investments, international investors and foreign direct investment to go into different jurisdictions because of the national interest perspective. So there are a lot of aspects to take over. And the thing is, like, there's the first question, like being economist also, I would say, and ask, what is the best economic model that can be taken into consideration going into space without the existing mindset that we have, is to use, abuse, and go on and enrich, making this capital accumulation in the hand of the few. And now we see that the billionaires are fighting not for getting that capital distribution to everyone, as we know very well. The international space law the principles were done before. So today we see how Elon, and you have Bezos, and you have the other billionaires are trying to fight over that. So the question is, like, what is the best economic model that we could apply, and how we stop these billionaires to go further with the same mindset, knowing that international law plays a drastic role to achieve that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that fantastic summary of your thoughts, Malaka. It was really interesting as well. I think, like as Stephen mentioned, if I had all the answers as to what is the best sustainable economic model, I'd be getting a Nobel Peace Prize as well. Sadly, I won't be up for that. But I think just starting with the economic sustainability, but of course we need to broaden out to the broader social and environmental sustainability as well. But just looking at that more narrow question, how can we make it sustainable? At the moment, if you're creating a business, you're going to be thinking about who are the customers and where is the money coming from. And at the moment, the money is currently coming from mostly governments, and it's it's NASA. Sadly it's also behind the scenes of the military as well, and then billionaires. And at the moment, the economy, the space economy, and the predicted cislunar economy, it's all about it's self-sustaining space participants selling to other space participants. So there doesn't seem to be a model of getting a lot of revenue from non-space participants on Earth. But I think as time goes by, it's not entirely clear how we're going to move from everybody just swapping dollars between themselves in the space participant to space participant B2B economy, and how do we start bringing enough benefits to Earth that people are prepared to pay for them? And so if you're bringing a lot of minerals back to Earth, that's one way. But if you're bringing, what other benefits are there? And maybe these are just unknown unknowns. You know, who knows what the next fantastic technology that will be that comes? Will it just be technical discoveries that we find? Because I don't think anyone thinks, now broadening the idea of sustainability, I don't think anyone thinks that creating more billionaires is going to help anyone really other than those billionaires themselves. But is it possible that we get trickle down? I don't want to use the word trickle down because that's another model that hasn't proven to work very well. Is it going to be will there be more benefits to small businesses, and will there be more benefits to currently non-spacefaring countries? I think that's yet to be factored into the economic models that we have currently. But it's the challenge that the working group, the UN working group, is going to have to grapple with to some degree. So sorry, I've answered a question with the question really, but that's where we're at now so far. I suppose there might, just throwing out a couple of other things, that some of the technical benefits that might come might, for example, be if we figure out some way of making nuclear fusion work and using helium-3 from the moon, or if we figure out how to do solar power from space efficiently. There may be benefits that really do benefit humanity in a huge way. We might solve the climate change problem in some way, but I don't think there's a direct dotted line from one to the other yet.
Brilliant. I second that. I agree. And it's like when we see the old, let's say, old economies comparing to the new economies, the old economy will still function that way, which is based on not renewable, but based on fossils and so on. And the question is like how to move to a circular economy in space, probably, or a solar economy, which will be the ultimate one to be the best solution when we are on the moon. So is there any addition to Donna's insights?
Perhaps I could just add a word really to follow on from that. I used to be an investment banker before for 15 years, and of course, investments and working for corporations, you are driven by risk-reward ratios, yes? And the risks are high in space. Space is still a hazardous activity, particularly activities that yet we still don't quite understand. We still have a lot of information we need. We don't exactly know how these activities will work, how we will build habitations, how we will have a transportation system, how we will create energy on the surface of the moon to sustain life, how we will find food and you know, how we will extract the water from the, let's say, the deep Shackleton crater, how we will down the track have fuel converters, how we construct habitats. You know, there's so many unknowns that we have. Really, there is no economic model yet that can be put together with any certainty whatsoever, because we have so many things that we still need to work out. We need the information gathering before we can even put together. What we do know, based on what we do know, is that certain things are totally uneconomic. That is going up there and then returning. Now, that may at some point change. But in the end, the private entities are putting in a lot of capital now, those that can afford it, but that won't happen forever. At some point, their shareholders or they themselves will recognize that you can't keep on putting in money as endlessly if there's no sight of return. So there is no economic model at the moment that would work without government subsidy, without significant government involvement as a customer, as a facilitator, as a supporter, in so many ways, let alone the regulatory. And I think it's too early to work out what models will work. I think we can quite quickly dismiss models that won't work. It's too early, but it's going to be very significant, because in the end, as Donna says, how do you create a market? How do you create that demand, particularly if, at least in the relatively early stages of when these activities happen, we won't be bringing stuff back down to Earth, maybe ultimately. And so that the demand, the customers are not on Earth. The customers themselves will need to exist in that economy. And there are very few customers. And so is this the capable, the haves, creating an economy just for the haves? And that therefore will not necessarily filter down to benefit a much broader community. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Could I just add one more comment? Because I said that we don't have a clear dotted line, and this is really following on from what Stephen was saying too, between how we envisage the cislunar economy and benefits on Earth. But I would like to just almost to contradict what I just said. There are some early examples where that may even turn out to be where perhaps there are benefits. And one example is, for example, one of our clients that is developing a lunar regolith mining system is already finding that some of their patented methods for extracting water and helium-3 from lunar regolith can be used here on Earth in a way of improving mining processes on Earth that reduces the amount of carbon, and it is also much more efficient and profitable. So it's not necessarily pie in the sky, so to speak, to say that there are benefits on Earth to be had. It's just not always easy to see from where we are. So that's why I'm in two minds. I'm worried about doing a really bad job of setting humanity mining the moon and colonizing in the bad way that we might have done in the past. And I'm also excited that actually we can bring benefits to Earth with technical advances.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And going back to what Stephen just mentioned, that we don't see a clear economic model, and we don't know yet. And investors, they wouldn't be keen to take that much risk because there is a level of risk they are willing to take it in terms of investment and return on investment, and in how long they are ready to take. So the thing is, like when I made this practical example, which is the on-orbit servicing, the thing is, like the on-orbit servicing, it could recycle, it could mitigate the risk of the space debris, it could do all this economically. And the issue is like the on-Earth servicing, it's already a technology, and that technology it still have high risk. So the thing is, like to the chicken and the egg, who's going to start first? Are these investors willing to put the money, to inject the money into these activities and take the risk that probably they don't know exactly how it's going to be beneficial and what is the return or not? And tax money also involved, the government governmental institution when they do so, until where they are willing to go further, and is it going to be sustainable or not, for how long? And we don't want to start and stop in the middle, and we will be looking for a way out forever. So I agree in that, because space is risk, and there is a lot to sorry, I have a question from LinkedIn, and actually we answered this question earlier. Francisca touched upon it, and we answered it in the previous episode that you were a guest, Donna and Stephen, in that show. The question says, in effect, are there rules we all are willing to abide by in space? So I think we answered that many times, but Francisca, it's feel free please to give an answer to that.
Yes, thank you. I can try, but maybe I can also link this question to what colleagues just have been debating about, which is the question of the economy. Because I'm a little bit hesitant to see a lunar economy as an end in itself yet, and I think this is why it's difficult to compare it also to orbital activities maybe yet, because we just don't know so much about the celestial bodies. And so if there's a rule, you've been asking for a rule, a principle that we should maybe agree to, is that what I would like to bring to the table is maybe a prerogative of really science and scientific research, so that we start really conducting basic science and using the celestial body for all those ends and research questions that we really have around the globe, before doing all those mistakes that we've been doing on the Earth when creating economies. So for me, the maybe the more appropriate question is how do we sustain space exploration in a sustainable and in an economic way. So not focusing on the lunar economy itself, but using, of course, also economic models and principles and business models to sustain lunar exploration and use. And I mean, we've been saying that the moon is really just a stepping stone to also explore deep space and other celestial bodies. And I would really like to see that we agree on somehow a scientific prerogative.
Thank you so much. Thank you. The last question, I don't know if Kai-Uwe, you have more questions, but I will wrap up with this question. And it's kind of, it came from LinkedIn. It's kind of funny a little bit, but we talked so much about biological entities in space that probably they exist. And the question is like, how difficult will be the application of flows when it comes to biological entities that are as yet unknown? Are we ready for that? Legally.
Maybe I should start. So the space law that we have, you know, we would never be arrogant enough to suggest that any law that we've created, we would impose on, I don't know how one describes it, but let's say non-humans. So the laws that we have created by humankind to apply in the way international law does for humankind. But there have been scholars and space lawyers who have talked about law as it may apply to extraterrestrial life, if that's the right expression. Haley, for example, has written a lot about what he called meta law, and he has the golden rule. Now I've got to transcribe that: do unto others as they would expect you to do to them. I'm paraphrasing it and perhaps not entirely the right words. It's a really good question, and thank you to the person on LinkedIn who provided it, because again, we don't think about these things. We will need to think though about slightly tangentially, if we do have those permanent settlements on the moon, we will need to think about appropriate laws that govern the relationship between those people on the moon. From the basic things like, you know, they'll want to have kids, and they'll want to get married, and they'll kill each other or whatever. You know, what laws apply, what behavioral norms will apply to those human beings, what rights do they have? For example, if something goes wrong, do they have a right of return to Earth? You know, this is, of course, projecting well into the future. But if we are talking about humans permanently residing on the moon, then that is a unique, dangerous, hazardous environment with really unique characteristics. And we all need to work out a body of law that makes sense. And also in terms of, I don't know what the right expression is, nationality, in terms of, you know, their interactions. And if we have 20 people in that first colony from 20 different countries, as you see sometimes in the movies, then, you know, we can't say, well, the law of their nationality applies to each of them. That, of course, is a non sequitur. So we'll need to work out laws to govern the interaction of humans in these permanent settlements in the future. And I think that's an interesting discussion. People are beginning to talk about that as well. But in terms of extraterrestrial life, our laws don't apply, and we'll just have to work that out as we go. But people who are interested should look at the work of Haley.
Except I would add also that our laws, one area of law, or at least guidelines, is planetary protection, which is specifically designed to protect extraterrestrial life so that we don't destroy it before we've even found it. So, for example, if we're landing a probe on Venus or somewhere on a moon of Saturn or Jupiter, then we have rules about not contaminating those areas, so that if there are microbes on there, we don't wipe them out with some virus. Be shame if the coronavirus got there before we did.
Thank you so much. Francisca, do you have something to add to that? Okay, I don't have any further question myself. Oh, well, I have a lot always with the greatest experts. Of course, I would go on forever. I have just one thing to add. It's very, very important to have inter and intra-generational equity. And what we are seeing today, it's furthering the gap between nations. It's very, very important that we came to terms to see how nations I'm not going to say even developing, because actually they are unfortunate. They don't even have the basics during this pandemics. And I witnessed it. I was in Tunisia, it's in North Africa, and I've seen people, how they are dying. No infrastructure, no healthcare, nothing. So that's why I'm so like, yes, I will say fighting for human rights and equity, that everyone has equal chance in life, in healthcare, in space exploration, in everything that humanity, when we are moving together, no one is left behind. So I beg everyone is here today and listening, help us to mitigate the risk of having this inequity that it's going on and furthering. Help us not to have any unethical behavior from billionaires that they are trying to rule the world or trying to move further and accumulate the capital and widen the gap between nations. Please help us to do that, because actually I never do this. This is the first time I do it, because I've seen with my own eyes how people are, and that's very, very important that others, because I am in UAE and I am between UAE and Belgium, and I never seen what I've seen during my trip. I came back in shock with the situation. People are dying. They are outside in hospital in beds, outside of the hospital, no oxygen, nothing. So it's like even they received some help to vaccine, and the vaccine was warm. It wasn't good vaccine, so people, they died because of that. So yeah, here we are speaking about space, but some people, they are there, they do not have the basics, and I'm done with that. We don't want to have other De Beers, because actually De Beer as a company, it's known in international law to be the most unethical company humanity seen when they entered as business commercial activities in Africa. We don't want to have that on the moon, on Mars, or anywhere else. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mala.
I give you back the mic, Mr. Kai-Uwe.
Thank you very much, Malak. I couldn't say anything after this, please. So thank you very much. That was really moving. I might ask still one question, because we should try to turn back to the optimism that we really can make a change, and that space law is there to find ways of projecting justice, equality, equitability, and a joint way forward. Before doing so and asking that question in particular to Franziska and Stephen, I would like to add one point on the lunar economy and on the way how we will organize ourselves there. Stephen was talking about the 20 people, the 100 persons, humans. So I very much hope that they will be fed in a vegan way. We also have to see that, and this is not, this is really serious, whether there will be also other life forms, animals in particular, supporting that economy. And I really sincerely hope that this will not happen to then create also torture and suffering for animals on another planet or on the moon. So this is also something we forget. It's not only about humans, it's also about life in general. But now let me turn to the question. And both Franziska and Stephen have alluded to. And this might be the optimism we need. There has been now established a work plan and a working group in the legal subcommittee on this matter. And Franziska was one of the main promoters. She set up the idea, tried to find as many supporters as possible in Europe, but also around the world. And then this was put in the discussion. Stephen is one of the moderators for that, and he plays an extremely important role of trying to push everybody to consensus. Now, Franziska and Stephen, what can we expect from this new initiative? Can we hope that what we have been discussing might be reflected there? And this is also very important, and Malak, you said it. How can the views also of gender, so space for women, but also the young and the space generation can be made themselves heard in that process? Because this is not something for the diplomats, it's something for humankind. And what are your plans and what are your perspectives? Maybe Franziska first and then Stephen.
Thanks for this question. I feel that there's a little bit too much credit in there. You were referring to the establishment of the working group on space resources that was decided now by the legal subcommittee for a period of 5 years. And it was really a great success that we also here have with us one of the chairs now, so we could decide on the chairmanship of the working group. It's Stephen's colleague from Poland, Andrzej Mistal, and Stephen Freeland, who are going to be chairing this new working group. And yes, we have taken this decision also on the basis of input that we've prepared. Unfortunately, we are not fully there yet, so we still need to negotiate the mandate and the terms of reference of the working group, but I have really high hopes for the upcoming main committee of COPUS that we will succeed in this. And then really the exciting part of the working group starts, and what can we expect from it? That's the question. I think the most important part is that we can expect a really sincere discourse and dialogue amongst states. And those states will bring to the table also the views of other stakeholders, public, private entities, civil societies, and they will really depict and explain, I think, their views on the legal framework that is already in place for space resources activities. And already in this process about talking about how they interpret the existing legal framework, I think lots of clarity will be gained. And here I have to quote again what Stephen said before. I'm sincerely sure that there is more in common than divides us also with view to space resources. And then in the medium term, I hope that we can also achieve to come up with additional guidance on space resources activities. So really for this first kind of space resources activities that are used for scientific missions, for example, implement sustainability measures, information exchange, come up with really practical hands-on guidance for states and companies and whoever is going to be on the moon conducting these activities. So this is my hope, but I think the most important part is that we really start the discussion and have now a forum where we will bring this discourse to.
Thanks, Kai-Uwe. Thank you, Francisco, also for your kind words. I think that I am, I mean, obviously I'm now involved, and it's important that we do everything we can to serve the interests of the member states to bring consensus. But I am optimistic, although clearly COPOS is an intergovernmental process, and there's always going to be politics at play. But we conducted 8 sessions of consultations already leading up to the establishment of this working group during the legal subcommittee. And prior to that, and since then, we've had lots of informal dialogues with delegations. There's an incredible sense of good faith amongst countries that perhaps sometimes don't get on that well. But there's an incredible sense of good faith that we will move forward in a way where all of those voices will be heard. I mean, people criticize, and Francisca made reference to this, people criticize COPOS and say, well, the UN process is so slow, we've got to move. It's I think it's an extraordinary thing that in this time when getting consensus on big issues geopolitically around the world is quite tough, that we reach consensus on this really big issue about, we agree, we will set up this fora, we will move it forward, we will create the Bureau, and I'm honoured to be part of that. And we are very close to working out the precise mandate. So to achieve consensus on a big issue in these geopolitical times, to move forward, I think demonstrates that, because it would have been quite easy for that to fall apart if 1 or 2 countries had decided that, and nobody did. So I'm optimistic. What can we expect? Well, obviously nothing can be prejudged, but the discussions we're having, and you said Francisca and her delegation, but many others have been so constructive in moving this forward. And just yesterday, during this week, I've spoken with 3 or 4 other delegations from all sides of the political divide. So constructive. I sincerely believe that we will, in the end, reach a consensus about an appropriate way forward, taking into account all of those issues about sustainability, all of those issues about conflict avoidance, and all of those issues about understanding that we need to understand what we're doing before we progress. You know, so to really get the perspective, and notwithstanding what one might hear from corporations who are doing extraordinary work in terms of technology, I really do think that states will come together and find a way forward. Again, Kai-Uwe, I'm not in a position, obviously, to prejudge what the outcomes might be, but I think with the support of delegations like Francisca's, I think there will be outcomes that, given that humanity has decided this is what they want to do, that will take us on the right path rather than a path that perhaps we want to avoid. I'm sorry for the general answer, but there is a sense of optimism, I think.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Donna, Francisca, and Stephen. Thank you very much. Back to our host, Jen.
Thank you, everyone. This was a very insightful episode. Let all voices will be heard. That's stuck in my ears, and let's not widen the gap between the have and the have-nots. Your remarks, Malak, I heard you. I myself, I was born in a developing country from Laos. I know both sides of the world, and as we now have experienced together this crisis, and let's work towards not to widen this gap, even though I feel like the gap is just widening, even though we work together for the past 50 years, not to make this happen. So we all pledge to stand together, and we'll continue to do the work. It's an honor and privilege to be alive in these times of disruption, rapid change, and I'm very honored and privileged to have you as mentors and leaders to support the work for yourself and for humanity. So thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Stephen and Kai-Uwe and Donna and Franziska. We hope we can collaborate with you once again in the future. Thank you for Malak, who has been curating this episode. Without your support, it would not be possible. And we welcome you for the next episode on the 25th of July, oscillating between acceptance and rejection, decentralized digital currencies, financial and legal challenges. So we pledge to continue and work towards a common goal. Thank you, everyone, and stay well.